Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, Chapter 9. The British Imperial Crisis, Africa, Ireland and India, to 1926. Introduction. The old statement that England acquired its empire in a fit of absent-mindedness is amusing but does not explain very much. It does, however, contain an element of truth. Much of the empire was acquired by private individuals and commercial firms, and was taken over by the British government much later. The motives which impelled the government to annex areas which its citizens had been exploiting were varied, both in time and in place, and were frequently much different from what an outsider might believe. Britain acquired the world's greatest empire because it possessed certain advantages which other countries lacked. We mention 3 of these advantages: 1, that it was an island; 2, that it was in the Atlantic; and 3, that its social traditions at home produced the will and the talents for imperial acquisition. As an island off the coast of Europe, Britain had security as long as it had control of the narrow seas. It had such control from the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 until the creation of new weapons based on air power in the period after 1935. The rise of the German Air Force under Hitler, the invention of the long-range rocket projectiles V2 weapon in 1944, and the development of the atomic and hydrogen bombs in 1945 to 1955 destroyed England's security by reducing the defensive effectiveness of the English Channel. But in the period 1588 to 1942, in which Britain controlled the seas, the Channel gave England security and made its international position entirely different from that of any continental power. Because Britain had security, it had freedom of action. That means it had a choice whether to intervene or to stay out of the various disputes which arose on the continent of Europe or elsewhere in the world. Moreover, if it intervened, it could do so on a limited commitment, restricting its contribution of men, energy, money, and wealth to whatever amount it wished. If such a limited commitment were exhausted or lost, so long as the British fleet controlled the seas, Britain had security, and thus had freedom to choose if it would break off its intervention or increase its commitment. Moreover, England could make even a small commitment of its resources of decisive importance by using this commitment in support of the second strongest power on the continent against the strongest power, thus hampering the strongest power and making the second power temporarily the strongest, as long as it acted in accord with Britain's wishes. In this way, by following balance of power tactics, Britain was able to play a decisive role on the continent, keep the continent divided and embroiled in its own disputes, and do this with a limited commitment of Britain's own resources, leaving a considerable surplus of energy, manpower, and wealth available for acquiring an empire overseas. In addition, Britain's unique advantage in having security through a limited commitment of resources by control of the sea was one of the contributing factors which allowed Britain to develop its unique social structure, its parliamentary system, its wide range of civil liberties, and its great economic advance. The powers on the continent had none of these advantages. Since each could be invaded by its neighbors at any time, each had security, and thus freedom of action only on rare and brief occasions. When the security of a continental power was threatened by a neighbor, it had no freedom of action, but had to defend itself with all its resources. Clearly, it would be impossible for France to say to itself, "We shall oppose German hegemony on the continent only to the extent of 50,000 men or of $10 million. Yet as late as 1939, Chamberlain informed France that England's commitment on the continent for this purpose would be no more than 2 divisions. Since the continental powers had neither security nor freedom of action, their position on the continent always was paramount over their ambitions for world empire, and these latter always had to be sacrificed for the sake of the former whenever a conflict arose. France was unable to hold on to its possessions in India or in North America in the 18th century, because so much of its resources had to be used to bolster French security against Prussia or Austria. Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803 because his primary concern had to be his position on the continent. Bismarck tried to discourage Germany from embarking on any overseas adventures in the period after 1871, because he saw that Germany must be a continental power or be nothing. Again, France in 1882 had to yield Egypt to Britain, and in 1898 had to yield the Sudan in the same way, because it saw that it could not engage in any colonial dispute with Britain while the German army stood across the Rhineland. This situation was so clear that all the lesser continental powers with overseas colonial possessions, such as Portugal, Belgium, or the Netherlands, had to collaborate with Britain, or at the very least be carefully neutral. So long as the ocean highway from these countries to their overseas empires was controlled by the British fleet, they could not afford to embark on a policy hostile to Britain, regardless of their personal feelings on the subject. It is no accident that Britain's most constant international backing in the 2 centuries following the Methuen Treaty of 1703 came from Portugal, and that Britain has felt free to negotiate with a third power, like Germany, regarding the disposition of the Portuguese colonies, as she did in 1898 and tried to do in 1937 to 1939. Britain's position on the Atlantic, combined with her naval control of the sea, gave her a great advantage when the new lands to the west of that ocean became one of the chief sources of commercial and naval wealth in the period after 1588. Lumber, tar, and ships were supplied from the American colonies to Britain in the period before the advent of iron, steam-driven ships after 1860. And these ships helped to establish Britain's mercantile supremacy. At the same time, Britain's insular position deprived her monarchy of any need for a large professional, mercenary army, such as the kings on the continent used as the chief bulwark of royal absolutism. As a result, the kings of England were unable to prevent the landed gentry from taking over the control of the government in the period 1642 to 1690, and the kings of England became constitutional monarchs. Britain's security behind her navy allowed this struggle to go to a decision without any important outside interference, and permitted a rivalry between monarchy and aristocracy, which would have been suicidal on the insecure grounds of continental Europe. Britain's security combined with the political triumph of the landed oligarchy to create a social tradition entirely unlike that on the continent. One result of these two factors was that England did not obtain a bureaucracy such as appeared on the continent. This lack of a separate bureaucracy loyal to the monarch can be seen in the weakness of the professional army already mentioned, and also in the lack of a bureaucratic judicial system. In England, the gentry and the younger sons of the landed oligarchy studied law in the Inns of Court, and obtained a feeling for tradition and the sanctity of due process of law, while still remaining a part of the landed class. In fact, this class became the landed class in England just because they obtained control of the bar and the bench, and were thus in a position to judge all disputes about real property in their own favour. Control of the courts and of the Parliament made it possible for this ruling group in England to override the rights of the peasants in land, to eject them from the land, to enclose the open fields of the medieval system, to deprive the cultivators of their manorial rights, and thus to reduce them to the condition of landless rural labourers or of tenants. This advance of the enclosure movement in England made possible the agricultural revolution, greatly depopulating the rural areas of England, as described in the deserted village of Oliver Goldsmith, and provided a surplus population for the cities, the mercantile and naval marine, and for overseas colonization. The landed oligarchy which arose in England differed from the landed aristocracy of continental Europe in the 3 points already mentioned. 1. It got control of the government. 2. It was not opposed by a professional army, a bureaucracy, or a professional judicial system, but on the contrary it took over the control of these adjuncts of government itself, generally serving without pay, and making access to these positions difficult for outsiders by making such access expensive. And 3. It obtained complete control of the land, as well as political, religious, and social control of the villages. In addition, the landed oligarchy of England was different from that on the continent because it was not a nobility. This lack was reflected in 3 important factors. On the continent, a noble was excluded from marrying outside of his class, or from engaging in commercial enterprise. Moreover, access to the nobility by persons of non-noble birth was very difficult, and could hardly be achieved in much less than 3 generations. In England, the landed oligarchy could engage in any kind of commerce or business, and could marry anyone without question, provided she was rich. Moreover, while access to the gentry in England was a slow process which might require generations of effort acquiring land holdings in a single locality, access to the peerage by act of government took only a moment, and could be achieved on the basis of either wealth or service. As a consequence of all these differences, the landed upper class in England was open to the influx of new talent, new money, and new blood, while the continental nobility was deprived of these valuable acquisitions. While the landed upper class of England was unable to become a nobility, that is, a caste based on exalted birth, it was able to become an aristocracy, that is, an upper class distinguished by traditions and behavior. The chief attributes of this aristocratic upper class in England were 1. That it should be trained in an expensive, exclusive, masculine, and relatively Spartan educational system centering about the great boys' schools like Eton Harrow or Winchester. 2. That it should imbibe from this educational system certain distinctive attitudes of leadership, courage, sportsmanship, team play, self-sacrifice, disdain for physical comforts, and devotion to duty. 3. That it should be prepared in later life to devote a great deal of time and energy to unpaid tasks of public significance, as justices of the peace, on country councils, in the county militia, or in other services. Since all the sons of the upper classes receive the same training, while only the oldest by primogeniture was entitled to take over the income-yielding property of the family, all the younger sons had to go out into the world to seek their fortunes, and as likely or as not would do their seeking overseas. At the same time, the uneventful life of the typical English village or county, completely controlled by the upper-class oligarch, made it necessary for the more ambitious members of the lower classes to seek advancement outside the county, and even outside England. From these two sources were recruited the men who acquired Britain's empire, and the men who colonized it. The English have not always been unanimous in regarding the empire as a source of pride and benefit. In fact, the middle generation of the 19th century was filled with persons such as Gladstone, who regarded the empire with profound suspicion. They felt that it was a source of great expense. They were convinced that it involved England in remote strategic problems, which could easily lead to wars England had no need to fight. They could see no economic advantage in having an empire, since the existence of free trade, which this generation accepted, would allow commerce to flow no matter who held colonial areas. They were convinced that any colonial areas, no matter at what cost they might be acquired, would eventually separate from their mother country, voluntarily if they were given the rights of Englishmen, or by rebellion, as the American colonies had done. If they were deprived of such rights, in general, the Little Englanders, as they were called, were averse to colonial expansion on the grounds of cost. Although upholders of the Little England point of view, men like Gladstone or Sir William Harcourt continued in political prominence until 1895, this point of view was in steady retreat after 1870. In the Liberal Party, the Little Englanders were opposed by Imperialists like Lord Rosebery even before 1895. After that date, a younger group of Imperialists like Asquith, Grey, and Haldane took over the party. In the Conservative Party, where the anti-imperialist idea had never been strong, moderate imperialists like Lord Salisbury were followed by more active imperialists like Joseph Chamberlain or Lords Curzon, Selborne, and Milner. There were many factors which led to the growth of imperialism after 1870, and many obvious manifestations of that growth. The Royal Colonial Institute was founded in 1868 to fight the Little England idea. Disraeli, as Prime Minister 1874 to 1880, dramatized the profit and glamour of empire by such acts as the purchase of control of the Suez Canal, and by granting Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India. After 1870, it became increasingly evident that however expensive colonies might be to a government, they could be fantastically profitable to individuals and companies supported by such governments. Moreover, with the spread of democracy and the growing influence of the press and the expanding need for campaign contributions, individuals who made fantastic profits in overseas adventures could obtain favorable support from their governments by contributing some part of their profits to politicians' expenses. The efforts of King Leopold II of Belgium, using Henry Stanley to obtain the Congo area as his own preserve in 1876 to 1880, started a contagious fever of colony grabbing in Africa, which lasted for more than 30 years. The discovery of diamonds in 1869 and of gold in 1886 in South Africa, especially in the Boer Transvaal Republic, intensified this fever. The new imperialism after 1870 was quite different in tone from that which the Little Englanders had opposed earlier. The chief changes were that it was justified on grounds of moral duty and of social reform, and not as earlier on grounds of missionary activity and material advantage. The man most responsible for this change was John Ruskin. Until 1870 there was no professorship of fine arts at Oxford. But in that year, thanks to the Slade bequest, John Ruskin was named to such a chair. He hit Oxford like an earthquake, not so much because he talked about fine arts, but because he talked also about the Empire and England's downtrodden masses, and above all because he talked about all three of these things as moral issues. Until the end of the 19th century, the poverty-stricken masses in the cities of England lived in want, ignorance, and crime, very much as they have been described by Charles Dickens. Ruskin spoke to the Oxford undergraduates as members of the privileged ruling class. He told them that they were the possessors of a magnificent tradition of education, beauty, rule of law, freedom, decency, and self-discipline, but that this tradition could not be saved, and did not deserve to be saved, unless it could be extended to the lower classes in England itself, and to the non-English masses throughout the world. If this precious tradition were not extended to these two great majorities, the minority of upper-class Englishmen would ultimately be submerged by these majorities and the tradition lost. To prevent this, the tradition must be extended to the masses and to the empire. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept it with him for 30 years. Rhodes, 1853 to 1902, feverishly exploited the diamond and gold fields of South Africa, rose to be Prime Minister of the Cape Colony 1890 to 1896, contributed money to political parties, controlled parliamentary seats both in England and in South Africa, and sought to win a strip of British territory across Africa, from the Cape of Good Hope to Egypt, and to join these two extremes together with a telegraph line and ultimately with a Cape to Cairo railway. Rhodes inspired devoted support for his goals from others in South Africa and in England, with financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Bate. He was able to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as De Beers Consolidated Mines, and to build up a great gold mining enterprise as Consolidated Gold Fields. In the middle of 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income of at least £1 million a year, then about $5 million, which was spent so freely for his mysterious purposes that he was usually overdrawn on his account. These purposes centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. For this purpose, Rhodes left part of his great fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford, in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world, as Ruskin had wanted. Among Ruskin's most devoted disciples at Oxford were a group of intimate friends including Arnold Toynbee, Alfred, later Lord Milner, Arthur Glazebrook, George, later Sir George Parker, Philip Littleton Gell, and Henry, later Sir Henry Berchenau. These were so moved by Ruskin that they devoted the rest of their lives to carrying out his ideas. A similar group of Cambridge men, including Reginald Balliol Brett, Lord Esher, Sir John B. Seeley, Albert Lord Grey, and Edmund Garrett, were also aroused by Ruskin's message and devoted their lives to extension of the British Empire and uplift of England's urban masses as two parts of the project, which they called extension of the English-speaking idea. They were remarkably successful in these aims because England's most sensational journalists, William T. Stead, 1849 to 1912, an ardent social reformer and imperialist, brought them into association with Rhodes. This association was formally established on February 5, 1891, when Rhodes and Stead organized a secret society of which Rhodes had been dreaming for 16 years. In this society, Rhodes was to be leader. Stead, Brett, Lord Esher, and Milner were to form an executive committee. Arthur Lord Balfour, Sir Harry Johnston, Lord Rothschild, Albert Lord Grey, and others were listed as potential members of a circle of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Milner as the Round Table Organization. Brett was invited to join this organization the same day, and Milner a couple of weeks later on his return from Egypt. Both accepted with enthusiasm. Thus the central part of the secret society was established by March 1891. It continued to function as a formal group, although the outer circle was apparently not organized until 1909 to 1913. This group was able to get access to Rhodes' money after his death in 1902, and also to the funds of loyal Rhodes supporters like Alfred Bate, 1853 to 1906, and Sir Abe Bailey, 1864 to 1940. With this backing, they sought to extend and execute the ideas that Rhodes had obtained from Ruskin instead. Milner was the chief Rhodes trustee, and Parkin was organizing secretary of the Rhodes Trust after 1902, while Gell and Berchenau, as well as others with similar ideas, became officials of the British South Africa Company. They were joined in their efforts by other Ruskinite friends of Stead's, like Lord Grey, Lord Esher, and Flora Shaw, later Lady Lagarde. in 1890 by a stratagem too elaborate to describe here. Miss Shaw became head of the colonial department of the Times, while still remaining on the payroll of Stead's Pall Mall Gazette. In this post she played a major role in the next 10 years, in carrying into execution the Imperial schemes of Cecil Rhodes, to whom Stead had introduced her in 1889. Stead or Steed, I don't know how to read the surname of this journalist. In the meantime, in 1884, acting under Ruskin's inspiration, a group which included Arnold Toynbee, Milner, Kell, Gray, Seeley, and Michael Glazebrook, founded the first settlement house, an organization by which educated upper-class people could live in the slums in order to assist, instruct, and guide the poor, with particular emphasis on social welfare and adult education. The new enterprise, set up in East London with P. L. Gell chairman, was named Toynbee Hall, and after Arnold Toynbee, who died aged 31 in 1883. This was the original model for the thousands of settlement houses, such as Hull House in Chicago, now found throughout the world, and was one of the seeds from which the modern movement for adult education and university extension grew. As Governor-General and High Commissioner of South Africa in the period 1897 to 1905, Milner recruited a group of young men, chiefly from Oxford and from Toynbee Hall, to assist him in organizing his administration. Through his influence, these men were able to win influential posts in government and international finance, and became the dominant influence in British imperial and foreign affairs up to 1939. Under Milner in South Africa, they were known as Milner's Kindergarten until 1910. In 1909 to 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as Round Table Groups in the chief British dependencies and the United States. These still function in 8 countries. They kept in touch with each other by personal correspondence and frequent visits, and through an influential quarterly magazine, The Round Table, founded in 1910 and largely supported by Sir Abe Bailey's money. In 1919, they founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, for which the chief financial supporters were Sir Abe Bailey and the Astor family, owners of the Times. Similar institutes of international affairs were established in the chief British dominions and in the United States, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations, in the period 1990 to 1927. After 1925, a somewhat similar structure of organizations, known as the Institute of Pacific Relations, was set up in 12 countries holding territory in the Pacific area, the units in each British Dominion existing on an interlocking basis with a Round Table Group and the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the same country. In Canada, the nucleus of this group consisted of Milner's undergraduate friends at Oxford, such as Arthur Glazebrook and George Parker, while in South Africa and India, the nucleus was made up of former members of Milner's Kindergarten. These included Sir Patrick Duncan, P.K. Long, Richard Feetham, and Sir Dougal Markham in South Africa, and Sir William Maris, James Lord Meston, and their friend Markham Lord Haley in India. The groups in Australia and New Zealand had been recruited by Steed through his magazine The Review of Reviews, as early as 1890 to 1893. By Parkin at Milner instigation, in the period 1889 to 1910, and by Lionel Curtis, also at Milner's request, in 1910 to 1919. The power and influence of this Rhodes-Milner group in British imperial affairs and in foreign policy since 1889, although not widely recognized, can hardly be exaggerated. We might mention as an example that this group dominated the Times from 1890 to 1912, and has controlled it completely since 1912, except for the years 1919 to 1922. Because the Times has been owned by the Astor family since 1922, this Rhodes-Milner group was sometimes spoken of as the Cliveden set, named after the Astor County country house where they sometimes assembled.